Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us to discuss the RA Enhancements Phase 1 draft tariff language. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by David Zlotlo, our Senior Counsel, and he will be going through the revisions today. On the line is also Abdul Muhammad Ali from Operations Engineering Services, Catalin Nixa from Transmission Infrastructure Planning, and then Lauren Carr, Gabe Murtaugh, and Bridget Sparks from Infrastructure Regulatory Policy. We did post the draft tariff language out on the initiative webpage on March 3rd, and then comments were due on that language on the 17th. We did receive a handful of comments, and so David has put together some updated language that we will be going through today, and that is what you see here on the screen. We will be taking questions throughout the call today, and you can enter the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. Just a reminder to everyone to please start by introducing themselves before asking a question. And then also today's call is being recorded, and the recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. So with that, I will hand it over to David, and we'll go ahead and get started.
All right. Hi, good afternoon. This is David Zlotlo. I'll be running through the draft tariff language. So we got comments from, I guess, about 5 or 6 entities. Let's see, SCE, PG&E, Vistra, Large Solar, let me get the acronym here, LSA, and SEIA joint comments, and I think that was it. And I'm sorry, there was one other party. Well, anyway, I'll be going through the comments organized by topic areas, same topic areas that were shown in the comment template. So again, we'll start by talking about the basics of the new planned outage substitution obligation, which is sections 9.3.1.3.1 through 9.3.1.3.5, and then going through some of the other topics that were outlined in that comment template. To start, I just want to sort of level set that this is a tariff stakeholdering process, so the point of the call here is to make sure that the draft tariff accurately captures the policy that will be going to our board shortly. So all of the call today is made on the assumption that that policy is finalized, it's approved, filed at FERC. So, you know, there might be some, and there were actually some what I'd consider more policy-oriented questions submitted in this process. And, you know, I think for the exercise today, we're assuming the policy is what it is, and we're just trying to make sure the tariff captures it. So it's a reminder. I think normally, you know, there's a little bit more distance in time between finalizing policy and the tariff drafting, so there's more separation, you know, because we're, you know, trying to get this in for the summer. We're moving quickly, and so the two sort of parallel processes are happening much closer in time than they normally would. So it's easy for those things to kind of bleed across each other. But again, just a reminder for today, we're just talking about, does the draft tariff match the policy? Okay, so with that, I will move into that first section I mentioned a moment ago, the new planned outage substitution obligation. I'll try to sort of organize or batch the areas of questions as best I can, but mostly I'll just sort of take it from the top and go. So first question from SCE, just a clarifying question. They're asking, is the process going forward that planned maintenance outages and approved planned outages will be automatically denied? Yes, that's the basic policy. If there's no substitution, then yes, it's an automatic denial, and that should be reflected in the first 2 subsections of 9.3.1.3. And I'll pause for questions as we go, but for now I just want to run through some of these first ones quickly. Vistra, in their comments, they suggested an edit to say that the ISO may deny the outages if there's no substitution. They're suggesting that adding in some operator judgment and discretion here would be good for all parties. Again, going to my opening comments, that's really inconsistent with the policy. The policy is that it's automatic, and so you know, adding in operator discretion would not be consistent with the policy. So another question from Vistra. They were asking for clarification on sort of the mechanics of this, asking, please clarify how the ISO will treat an outage that spans a month where the resource is only on a monthly supply plan for a single month. And then they ask, a couple permutations, if it's RA for the first month, not RA for the second month, vice versa, so on. So in terms of the mechanics of how this rule works, let's just scroll up a little bit so we see all of 9.3.1.3.1. There we go, thanks. So the idea here is, you focus on whether at the time, the outage is being considered, is the unit on an RA plan, on a monthly RA plan at the point when the outage is being considered. So for the 9.3.1.3.1, which is the ones that are considered at T-45, at T-45, if you're requesting an outage on a unit and the unit, is shown at RA at T-45, then you'll have basically immediately have to provide the substitution. So the question is, is it which month of, if it has been shown as RA for any month at the time the outage is being considered substitution, then it needs the substitution. So in other words, if it's shown for the first or second month at that point in time, then it would be required for substitution. So, sorry, that explanation might not help a ton, but basically the idea is if the unit is shown for RA in the monthly process at the time the outage is being considered for potential substitution, then it falls under this rule and it would need substitution. So I'll go through a few more and then I'll pause for questions. FTE asks, should substitute capacity match with the outage request exactly, or should substitution always include the full day of the start and end date of the outage? Existing tariff says that the substitution covers the full day of the start date, full date of the end date. That's existing language, and that is going to remain in place. It's now in proposed section 9.3.1.3.5. But so that's an existing rule. It remains. It's just being shuffled around a little bit in terms of where it shows up. But that's not changing. That the substitution has to match the full start and full end date. So I'll stop there for questions to see if there's any questions so far on what I've gone through, and then we'll move on with some of the other questions on the new planned outage.
So as a reminder to enter the question queue, you can do so by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad.
Looks like we do have a few questions in the queue so far. I'll go ahead with the first caller. Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I just had a process question, and so I think this is really the only opportunity to ask it, so I apologize if it's not quite on point. But LSA had proposed in the last comments on the final proposal, had proposed 2 modifications, and one of them was to exempt very small megawatt outages, like just a few megawatts, just from having to go out and find substitute capacity. And the other one was clarifying the obligation for variable resources being counted for RA and to clarify the substitution amount that was required. I looked at the board materials that were posted. I couldn't, those were not addressed. It wasn't even mentioned in the memo as far as stakeholder comments. And so we did propose some language in our comments here to implement that in case it was accepted, although we have no idea really what the status is of those proposals. Could we get some comments on that or some information on that?
Yeah, so I haven't gotten there yet, but yes, there's
okay.
You had comments, and then there's a couple others about the subsection talking about the exemptions. It's 9.3.1.3.3.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll get to that.
If you're going to address that, yeah, I can wait.
Yeah.
If you're going to address those. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Moving on to our next question. Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Kathleen Colbert from District. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, good afternoon.
Hi, how's it going? I just wanted to, two follow-ups. I think the first one to note, just to clarify on the suggestion for a may deny, yeah, you captured the one instance of maybe there is some more flexibility, and I think that there were some suggestions on that later on the language. This particular suggestion was just to capture the reality that exceptions actually are already a part of the policy, so I just wanted to clarify that. And I know you detail them in the new section 9.3.1.3.3 exceptions, fully admitting, I think that there's your legal discretion to whether or not the may deny is actually needed in the first few sections. Since you have this new explicit section, I was just flagging it might make it a tiny bit clearer that there is some discretion. There are a couple exclusions, but defer to you on how you.
I see. Oh, okay. So your point would be for the first two sections, if it started by saying, unless covered by an exemption in section 9.3.1.3.3,
yeah.
comma, oh, okay.
Yes, that makes
right, well,
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I just wanted to clarify my thinking there, so you're on the same page as well, but defer to you. And the second thing I wanted to know, I think what I'm trying to confirm with my permutations in my scenario is that if you have an outage that spans multiple months, and let's say you are only RA for one of those months, then just the simple scenario was 2 months, that the intent of the policy, so with your intent of the policy was that this substitution obligation is only for the month that you're on an RA plan. I think that's the intent, but I wanted to confirm that.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, if you're not RA, then there's no substitution. Yes. I guess I thought you were asking a different question about whether if you don't, you're RA for 1 month, not RA for the other month, and you don't provide substitution for the part where you are RA, will we still have authority to deny the whole outage? And what I was saying is yes, but the question of whether you have to provide substitution for times when you're not RA, no, you don't.
Okay, that's helpful clarification, David. And just flagging for you, I'll look at the language again with that lens that you updated and make sure that that's what I think I read. But if you could take a look at that and just, I think you could read this as it requires substituting the entire outage. I just want to make sure that read isn't there.
No, we would not be requiring substitution for times when you're not RA. So yeah, okay, I'll see if there's something to make that more clear. But fair point.
Thank you.
All right, there's one question in the queue after this. Should I go through and put them through?
Sure, go ahead.
Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, this is Susan again. I apologize. This one is a substantive question. The last sentence in this paragraph, or in this section, says that the treated forced outage is for rain, but the resource may not provide RA substitute capacity per, and then there's a section of the chair. Can you explain what that last exclusion, where the resource may not provide the substitute capacity? Can you explain what that means here?
Yes. Okay. Well, again, yeah, I had a block of questions on that, but you know what? We'll just go to that right now since you're asking. I don't want to put you off the second time. So yeah.
You can do that if it's sufficient. I don't mind that.
No. I'll just cover that right now. That whole area. Okay. Let me explain what that was getting at, and then I'll sort of address the comment. Hopefully that resolves it, and then you can sort of check that off for the to-do.
That'll work.
For this afternoon. Okay. So the point of that is, with this rule, it's keyed off whether a resource has been shown on a monthly RA plan or not. And so that sort of second paragraph of the two primary sections, it says, once the CAISO permits a maintenance outage to begin, then it says a whole bunch of other stuff. What that is meant to capture is in the cases of a long-term maintenance outage, one that goes, more than two months or so, because you could, for example, if you have, we're in March now, so let's say someone comes and wants to take an outage for, April through July. So if these new rules were in place today, we have April through July. So the April and May RA monthly showings have been made already. So we know that resource is or isn't shown as RA on the monthly plan for April and May already. But we don't know June and July yet because the monthly RA showing deadlines haven't happened yet. And so what we're saying here is in that hypothetical outage that shows up today, you would have to provide substitution for, immediately for the outage to be allowed to start for the April and May month. So you do that or it doesn't get approved, you're not allowed to start the maintenance outage. But you do that, the outage is started, and then the June RA deadline is like roughly April 15th, to July is roughly May 15th. When those deadlines come, then you would have to provide substitution. And what we're saying here is if you don't, in that case of that long-term outage, we're not going to force the outage, we're not going to force the unit to come back online. If you're in the middle of maintenance, it's already started. We can't really, we're not going to force it to end prematurely if you're in the middle of the work already. So it's just acknowledging that in that case, we'll let the outage finish. But if you don't provide the substitution at that deadline for the June RA month or the July RA month, it's saying any such period will be treated as a forced outage for purposes of rain. So you'll get rain. This is the small scenario under these new rules where a maintenance outage would still be subject to rain today. So that's what that first part of that last sentence is saying. So in that scenario, you'll get rain. Then that last part about saying, but you may not provide substitute capacity per section 40.9.3.6.2. What that is saying is you had a deadline to provide substitute capacity. That deadline was at the monthly showing deadline for the months of June and July. We're not going to give you all the way to the forced outage substitution time frame because you're still a maintenance outage. You have a deadline. You had your chance. You didn't provide it, and you get rain, and we move on. That's what that last part is saying because the forced outage substitution deadline is, I think, up to like the morning of the outage or the day before or whatever. We're saying here, in that case, we're not going to give you that deadline to provide the substitution. You have the regular new maintenance outage substitution deadline, which is covered in 93131 and 93132. That's the that's what the last paragraph of the two main posers here are saying. Okay,
so you're saying that the RA plan outage substitution rules override the rain substitution rules. That's what you're trying to say. Are you getting that right?
I'm not sure. Override. I mean, it's so. This is saying in that case of that long-term outage, it's treated as it's subject to rain, but it's still being treated as a maintenance outage for purpose of for the substitution deadline.
Okay, I think this is going to need a little more explanation than what you have here. This is actually not very clear. I think what you're trying to say is that because the planned outage requirements require an earlier substitution date, that you can't wait till what would normally be a rain substitution date to provide capacity to avoid rain. If you don't meet the RA substitution date, then you're going to be subject to rain. Am I understanding that?
Yeah, I mean, that part,
Okay.
yes. You'll be subject to rain if you don't meet the planned outage substitution deadline.
Yes. Okay. Okay. All right. I think, yeah, that could probably be stated a little more clearly, but I do appreciate the explanation. Thank you.
Okay. So, while we're on the subject of that second paragraph, I'll just note real quick. So SDG&E had a question, along the same lines, just asking what is the purpose of this paragraph? Is that part of the transition period covered elsewhere? No, as I just said, it's not part of the transition period. It's really meant to cover a very specific scenario of a long maintenance outage that extends out multiple months. And then, okay, so, yeah, and then so PG&E and Vista, I think, also had questions along the same lines. What is the purpose of that language? So I'll take questions from you all in just a moment here. That explanation will leave some questions for you. And then Vistra additionally said, noted here it's saying the CAISO permits a maintenance outage to begin, pointing out that the tariff terminology is more normally about the ISO approving the outage rather than permitting it. Yes, that's a fair point. The point here was, though, to distinguish between outages that are approved versus outages, because we talk about approved maintenance outages that are subsequently not approved, because, for example, the T-45 deadline, if you request the outage 4 months ahead of time, it'll be approved, but then if you don't provide the substitution, it'll be subsequently, denied. And so what this language here was not meant to capture that. It was meant to sort of say the outage has actually started. That's what the scenario is. It's actually started. And then when I say permits, that was meant to say it actually started, and it actually has started, under ISO authority. So, perhaps we could say once it's been granted final approval and it has begun, I think that might be, maybe if that helps make it more clear, we could look at changing it to say that. So with that, if there's any of those other parties, San Diego, PG&E, Vistra, LSA, we just talked to, have questions about that second paragraph of the two primary sections about once the outage has started, if there are any more questions on that, please go ahead now. Are there any questions, operator?
Yes, we have about 2 more questions in the queue. Would you like me to go ahead to the next caller?
Please.
Sure, go ahead. And just a reminder to our speakers, if you're not speaking, just make sure you're on mute. There's a little bit of background noise.
Caller, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, David. This is Weizo from SCE. I think we submit a set of questions, and I have to admit that I'm not that close to operations. But I think you mentioned something about the process. So I just have a overall comment, which we also include in our comments that I look at the final proposal. I don't see any mentioning about the exact hours, like how long you would provide to find a substitution outage in the final proposal. I know that was discussed in the workshop, but it seems not fully addressed in the final proposal. So I think you kind of made a change. So if you can talk a little bit on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, there were a couple of sets of questions on that. I'll turn to that next. I just want to finish out if there's any further questions on the issue about once the paragraph about once the ISO permits the outage to begin. But I'll turn to that next once we see if there's any further questions on the topic I was just addressing now.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Would you like me to move on to the next caller?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Caller, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. This is Kathleen from Vista again. Hey, David, your stream of conscious thinking on the permits or approves sounded pretty good to me on first blush, just as a instant feedback. I think that would help clarify a little bit. So thank you for that. If you consider that, I think that language would be helpful. I think one follow-up comment on the forced substitution, forced outage substitution functionality that's available today. I think I understand your current thinking about how you talked through what you're trying, what the text is attempting to say in the second paragraph. I don't recall, but I am not trying to be, to raise kind of like a policy discussion, but I did want to flag, I don't recall this ever being discussed in the policy process about changes to the ability to submit substitution in the forced outage timeframe. I may be missing that the existing tariff only allows that for forced outages, but I thought the functionality could be done in the real time. I'm not aware of that restriction, but perhaps that exists, and that's what I'm missing, that it can only be for a forced outage and this is considered a planned outage. Can you help clarify that?
I think I understand the question. Let me just sort of say what the status quo is, and then I'll say how we're changing it, and maybe that answers your question. So, right, today the POSO runs, the first planned outage substitution run is at between T-25 and T-22. At that point, if you have your outage in by T-25, you'll be told whether or not you have a substitution obligation or not. If you submit it afterwards, then it's a rolling analysis, I guess, at once a day or multiple times a day. So if you get a substitution obligation assigned in either one of those time frames, then today you have until the T-8 to the outage to provide the substitution. So that's the current rules. That's all for planned outages. For forced outages, there's a separate timeline to provide substitution, which is, it's in the BPM. I believe it's like a certain time on the operating day is your last chance to do it. So what this proposal is changing is the timeline for maintenance outages or planned outages. Those must have substitution provided by the deadline set in this new tariff language that we're talking about now. So that opportunity to go up to T-8 to provide substitution, that part is going away. Now you have a much earlier deadline. What we're saying is the policy did not address the forced outage substitution timeline, and that will stay as it is. We're not changing that. So if you're a forced outage, then you have the opportunity to provide substitution up to whatever the existing deadline is. So that part is not changing. So does that clarify your question about?
Yes, that does. That was really helpful. Thank you for going through that one more time. My follow-up, and it was another request that we submitted, is what I'd like to confirm, and I think that there's some confusion on this point even today, but if the planned outage is denied, but and the scenarios I was giving, I understand what you're saying about not wanting to capture those other kind of issues and allow for the operator judgment because it wasn't in this current conversation, but there are some of those outages that have to be taken that we're all aware of. So I don't need to reiterate what they might be, but in that instance, yeah.
I'll get to that topic in a moment.
Oh, you will? Okay.
Yes. There were multiple comments on the idea of, carrying on from the last stakeholder call about the plan to force issues and all that. Yes, is that what you were getting at?
Yes, let me tie it to this.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and I'm fine with you waiting and getting to it but what I'm trying to make it link to is not reading in that if you do touch on that, what's then the forced outage substitution? Is it still able to do that? That's really the link I'm just trying to make with this last sentence, is that
Yeah.
So kind of connecting that when you do get to that response would be helpful.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay, thank you, David.
All right. So, operator, are there any, is anyone queued up as of yet? Otherwise, I can move to that question about 48 hours, which, I think SCE had and others as well.
We did have a question just jump in the queue just now. Would you like me to put them through?
Yeah, we'll take that question and then I'll move on to that next topic.
All right, caller, you are now unmuted.
Hi, this is Mike Perry from PG&E. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so our question focuses on the timeline. I know through the policy phase, it's been about as soon as it becomes an RA resource. And in the tariff and the BPM, some of the analysis that the ISO is doing around RA plans and supply plans, resources available, it doesn't happen until T-30. And we're curious how to deal with some of the changes that happen between LSEs and SCs in that 15-day time frame where you could put a resource in or someone gives you a resource and then they're changing it around and you're having to provide substitution. And in theory, how tracking that substitution being released, like it's a much different process than is currently done. And that's, I think we're wondering if T-30 isn't the better timeline to use when everything sort of gets locked into place.
Okay. Right. Well, I guess I'll for the moment, I will rely on the idea that the policy was at the RA deadline, RA showing deadline of T-45. I mean, I think you're highlighting arguments for why T-30 would be a better deadline, but, I think I'll have to see if any of the folks from policy are on the line who could maybe address just very briefly, because it does get a little bit beyond tariff drafting, but, why we stuck with the T-45 versus the T-30. But I think the idea was keying it to once it's RA, it has to provide substitution, and that was consistent with the sort of more general principle that would apply for requests after supply plan submission deadline, which is do it immediately. And that was sort of what we were trying to do. The whole reason why we were waiting to T-45 was we don't know if it's RA yet for certain, and so that's why we had to wait till T-45. But the overall principle was do it immediately, or not, virtually immediately. And so I think that was the principle we're trying to carry out through this, and so that's why the T-30 I think doesn't fit with that principle. But I don't know if if others can maybe expound on that a little bit. But that's sort of for the tariff drafting purposes, that's kind of why it is the way it is that you saw in the draft.
Yeah, it seems like you may not be an RA resource up until T-30, right? Like that's the hard deadline where you can't touch your RA and supply plans anymore. And that's kind of what we were sort of in our comments are trying to point to, is that that's really the final, like that's it, you're locked in for the month, and it understandably you should provide substitution at that point, knowing that the resource has the obligation, but it could change in that 15 days between T-45 and T-30.
Sure. No, I understand that point.
Okay.
We'll have to just think about that.
Okay, thank you.
No, I understand.
Yeah, hi, David. This is Abdul. I have a question. I think a comment and then a question. I think the thought is, T-45, the showings are in. That's the due date for the showings. It's the next 15 days, that's till T-30, is an opportunity for people to fix errors or to, cure if needed. I'm sorry, I didn't get the caller's name, but are you are you suggesting, I think if a resource comes in, is used as a queue or by T-30, then I would assume when it shows up at T-30, then, in the next planned outage run, we'll capture it, and then it will assess any outages on it. But if it was previously shown at T-45, is there a scenario where you think it would be removed from the plans, and why would that happen?
It has happened before, and it can happen via counterparties telling us to use a different resource, or I don't know the underlying reasons. We just see the movements because we're, reconciling, like you said, like you're really reconciling the RA and supply plans in those 15 days for any inconsistencies, or someone might need incremental capacity, and sometimes it's, contract cancellation. I'll use an example. QFs can cancel pretty quickly, and you would have to remove a resource pretty quickly to get that off, to ensure that there's no obligation there. And we were just thinking about sort of all those movements happening, and you could be providing substitution for something that wouldn't actually be an RA resource at T-30 when everything locks. If that makes sense?
I think so. We have an option today, and I think we're not planning to remove that option, which is to cancel a substitution. So in this scenario where, you removed, and I'm not sure if you can do that, but let's say you remove the resource from your showings, you can cancel the substitution. I mean, we give you the option to cancel substitution today, and we're planning to keep that option to cancel substitution tomorrow, as long as, the outage hasn't started, obviously.
Yeah, I think so. We know the rules are you can, like, if necessary, remove a resource, then put something back in its place to make sure we're meeting multiple obligations at the same time. So it's not like overall reduction in what's shown, but in mismatch scenario or otherwise. I don't know if that is helpful. Like I said, we're just trying to look for the point at which the resource is finally confirmed as a RA resource, and that's T-30. That's when, under the current BPM and current tariff, that's when the local assessment is done, and that would sort of lock everything in and then provide substitution under that time frame. That gives a couple more weeks time to deal with anything.
Yeah, so I think we're going to have to sort of talk about this more internally, because I think, like I said before, the principle was you have to do it immediately, and that's what this, tariff sort of is meant to capture. But I think your more general point is, well, yeah, fine, but you're not definitely RA until T-30. It's not really T-45, and honestly, we'll have to discuss that more, because I'm not sure. I can't.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Certainly commit to that right now. I think we'll have to talk about that more.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thanks, sir.
Okay, so now what I can do is move to the sort of set of comments from, I think, FCE and PG as well. Had a question about this 48-hour timeline and what that was about. And so what's on the screen now, you can see it. It's basically the last sentence of the first paragraph, 9.3.1.3.1, and then there's a parallel sentence in 9.3.1.3.2. What you'll notice, first of all, is you see 48 hours is now 72 hours, but that doesn't answer the more general question about, well, where does that come from, whether it's 48 or 72 hours? What is that? So along the lines of what I was just saying, the principle is you must provide the substitution immediately, and that's sort of the basic principle that is behind all the planned outage substitution element of this. Where we added 48 hours and now we extended it to 72 hours just to sort of provide some implementation flexibility, the point was we weren't going to make the, you put in an outage request in OMS, and then you put in substitution sort of in Sierra. It's like two different systems. You can't literally do it simultaneously, so you have to provide some, sort of time period to do one, then do the other. And then so if it can't literally be simultaneous, then what? How much time do you give to let someone go back in and add the substitution? So I think we said 48 hours, and I'll explain, it's not actually 48 hours, but then we changed it to 72 hours. But what that time frame is saying is we're going to key it off of the POSO run, which I understand, I think it happens at 8 a.m. every day, or there's some set time that happens today. And the sort of software architecture is still going to be set up to do that. And so basically you put in the outage request, and then we're saying you'll have, up to 2 POSO runs to go in and provide the substitution. That's sort of the principle we want to do. And so rather than trying to spell that out in the tariff, we're saying the BPM will explain that deadline. So you'll have basically 2 POSO runs after the outage is requested in OMS. I think that in no case that should be more than 48 hours, but just to add just sort of more flexibility here, we're saying in the tariff that deadline can be no more than 72 hours after supply plan submission deadline or 72 hours of the outage being requested. But the actual deadline will be in the BPM. And like I said, our intent would be to say in the BPM it's within, the second POSO run after that initial deadline. And we're making it configurable just because to add a little bit of flexibility, but it's not a 48-hour, 72-hour deadline. It's not a hard hour deadline. It's keyed off of the sort of software run, and that will be spelled out in the BPM. So to the question of where was the 48 hours in the policy paper, it's not. It's really a way to put in, just acknowledge the fact you can't literally do 2 things at the same time, and so then we have to add in a little bit of a time buffer, and that 48 or 72 hours, that's the outer boundaries of how much of a buffer there could be. But again, the BPM will be more precise and say exactly what the deadline is, and that's how things will be configured based on the deadline to be determined in the BPM. As I said, our intent would be to have it based on the second POSO run after the supply plan submission or after the outage request. So SCE had questions on that, and I believe PG&E did as well, or actually their question was actually more towards the, similar question. So I'll pause there. If SCE or PG&E or anyone else has sort of questions about that timing question. So operator, if there are any questions on that, we can take those.
There are no hands raised in the queue at this time.
Okay. Very good. So I'm going to sort of double back a little bit to some of the topics I was covering at first. So let me just sort of look through and see if I can get back to some of the questions before. Okay. Some of these might have already been clarified by now. So one of them in writing was the PG&E topic we just discussed about having the outage, the T-30 versus T-45. Address that. SDG&E had a comment in the way this draft tariff was put together, asking whether RE resource is a defined term in the tariff. Yes, resource adequacy resource is already a defined tariff in Appendix A. And I think San Diego, they had some suggested edits, but I think the point would be that sort of a resource isn't an RA resource until the monthly supply plans are submitted. And so they had some suggested rewording of that. And I thought that was covered by what we proposed because it's, the draft tariff language is talking about we deny approved maintenance outages on RA resources. So the idea is, and a resource may not be an RA resource, puts in the outage, 4 months ahead of time, the ISO approves it, but then we can subsequently deny it because at T-45 it becomes an RE resource, then the new rules kicked in, and then it can be subsequently denied after it was first approved. So I think the sort of question of is it RA yet or not, I think was addressed by that. Hopefully that sort of explanation makes sense. I'll just take a moment here if anyone from SDG&E is on the line who has any further follow-up. Otherwise, we'll move on to some of the other topics. You can come in later if you have questions that occur to you later on that. So if SDG&E has anyone who has further questions on that, or if that addresses them, then we can move on.
As a reminder, you can enter the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad.
We do have a question in the queue at this time. I'll go ahead and put them through now. Caller, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, David. This is Weizo from SCE. I wasn't quick enough to raise my hand when you asked if any feedback from SCE in terms of timeline.
Okay.
So
here you are now. So go ahead.
Yeah. So I think I got your point about details will be in BPM. I wasn't really clear or, thinking about whether you need to put 72 hours in the tariff if you need to work out on the timeline in the BPM. I guess just something to think about. But thank you for, addressing the issue.
Yeah. So here's I understand that point. Why don't we just say do it by the deadline in the BPM? Why do we add that 72 hours? And I think that's right. I think sort of on the surface, yeah, we don't have other things in the tariff or most other things. If we say the deadline's in the BPM, that's it. The thought process of giving a sort of outer boundary of the discretion there was because, like I said, the policy was for it to be immediate and then just sort of as a acknowledgement of reality, it can't be literally immediately. So putting some time frame in the tariff helps sort of maintain some boundaries on this and keeps it more closely tied to what the initial policy principle is now. Because what I was honestly just concerned about a little bit was we put this now and then a year from now there's nothing in the tariff actually saying what the deadline is, and then we sort of over time can drift and extend the deadline out further, and the policy is that wouldn't be consistent with the policy we're doing here. So the idea of putting in an amount of time was to keep some boundary on how far out we can let it go, to just make sure we're not straying too far from what the policy principle is that underlies all of this. So that's why the timing is there in the tariff. Even though, yes, you're right. I mean, normally we just say it's in the BPM. Go look there.
Oh, okay, thank you. So maybe you can, I guess maybe you can draft the language a little bit more flexible, I guess. But I think I see your point, so thank you.
At this time, we don't have any other questions in the verbal queue.
Okay, great. Then we're still on some of the planned outage materials. I'll try to get through the rest of it quickly because we have the minimum state of charge material that is very detailed and probably a lot there as well. Real quick, so going to the outage reporting questions that we were sort of starting to get into briefly before, this question about planned versus forced outage issues. So we got into that a little bit on the last stakeholder call. I think, there's more generally sort of a need to clarify some of the existing sort of outage definitions, and that is in this stakeholder process, but that part of the initiative is, it's being covered in phase 2. So the more kind of global changes to how we're defining the different outage types, that needs to wait. So we're not really, in this filing, able to really heavily get into all of that material. So what we need to fall back on is the existing, interpretation that we've sort of, in the PRR 1122 process, which was a BPM change we proposed on some of this force versus outage. We had a pretty clear sort of principle about what is planned, what is forced, and I think, you know, for now we need to just rely on that, you know, our FERC filing will clarify that those prior sort of tariff interpretations still hold about planned versus forced outage reporting. That was all, you know, laid out in the BPM appeal process, and that so in the cases that were raised where you have a, you know, what an outage that's in the planned time frame, you need to take it, but it's, you know, something that, you know, needs to happen 2 weeks from now. So it's not forced outage yet, but it's critical. It's not like a part of the planned maintenance cycle that you do once a year or something like that. So what happens there? So you request the planned outage. If you don't have substitution right away, it would be denied. And then the question is, then what? Are we supposed to wait forever? And I think at that point we go back to some of the examples we laid out in the PR 1122 materials, which is, you know, the key question is at the time you submit the outage. If you, at the time you submit it as forced, is it actually forced? And so if we deny it at, you know, say you request it at T-12 or something, and then when you get to T-7, you're representing to us that no, we're at imminent, you know, danger of a catastrophic failure of your equipment, but then it's a forced outage and you can go ahead and submit it as forced, and then it'll be, you know, subject to RAIM as it is today, and then you can have up to the current deadline to provide substitution if you're able to find substitution. So that's sort of, I think we just have to rely on the existing set of interpretations we have around this topic. The more detailed clarification changes to outage terminology will happen in phase 2, and, you know, we're really not able to get into all of that in this filing, unfortunately, because I think, you know, it seems like there is some definitely interest in doing that since it's already scoped in the initiative, but it's just not something we can do for this filing now. So open to questions. I know San Diego and Vistra had questions on that. Yeah, so we'll open up the call to them if they want to get in the queue, or give them a moment. And while they are, I'll say then on this sort of more general topic, PG&E also had a question. They just sort of wanted to know, can we clarify that the substitution type should remain unchanged? For example, system RA can be used to substitute for local RA on planned outage. The answer there is that's not changing sort of the rules on what counts to be a substitute, you know, what can be a substitute for something else, all that status quo, we're not changing that. So,
are there any questions in the queue?
At this time, there are no questions in the queue.
Okay. David, I am seeing 2 questions in the chat, so would you like me to read those out to you?
One moment here. Yeah, please, why don't you do that? I'm not sure I can.
Okay. So T-45 is the initial submittal for RA supply plan and final submittal at T-30. RA resources are locked in at T-30 and allowed the 15 days to make adjustments if needed. Why the change back to T-45 to start the substitution timeline, and what happens to the study window and CSP offers?
Right. So I think that was really the issue we were talking about with PG&E. I think T-45 versus T-30, as I said, we're just going to have to take that back and talk about it a little bit more. But yeah, I think for now, for the purpose of this call, I don't think I can address that any further. Okay, and I do see this other question regarding the 48-hour to 72-hour submittal change. What happens on a 3-day weekend when an outage gets submitted after business hours? I mean, yeah, I mean, part of also to make, you know, we all have to operate 24/7, but, you know, still want to make at least some concessions here and be reasonable. You know, part of having a little bit of a time buffer was also to account for sort of business realities. You know, however, you know, fully extending it out all the way to capture a 3-day weekend, I think that probably goes too far. So, you know, I don't think we can sort of plan the rules for a 3-day weekend, but at least someone has to log in during the 3-day weekend. You have window of time in which to do it. Yeah, I don't think we're going to extend it all the way out, just, out of concern of 3-day weekends. So that's our answer to that one. Isabel, were there other chat questions that I missed?
No, those are the only two.
So let me just take stock here. So, okay. So covered the outage reporting questions. Just bear with me. I'm trying to see if there's other substitution. Okay, so the last big topic on the POSO was the exemption language, which LSA asked about that maybe 45 minutes ago. So now we'll get to that. Others, Vistra, SDE, all side questions. But, I made you wait, and now you're probably not going to like the answer. But I think, really we have the exemptions we have in the draft tariff. We did not build in the policy a de minimis exemption that LSA was asking about, but it would apply if it would not apply if it's below 3% or 5 megawatts. We didn't put in a de minimis exception, and that's really not part of the policy. Similarly, that thing about, LSA had a comment saying, well, what about, which I presume is probably most applicable for solar or wind maybe, where the sort of PMAX is greater than the interconnection amount. So some of the resources on outage, but there's additional capacity behind the interconnection that could sort of fill in the gap of the outage, and you're still able to provide more than your RA amount. Shouldn't that be okay? Why would we need substitution for that? I believe was the question. I'll open it up, make sure I didn't misunderstand the question. But I think, again, we didn't build that into the policy, but I think in that case, we take the outage off the non-RA part first anyways. So, I think in some cases, if part of the and I guess it would also be a question of portioning the outage. So if you have the interconnection amount is 100 and you have enough physical capacity there to do 120, something's on outage. I mean, I'm not actually sure if you'd apportion that, sort of basically apportion the outage to the part that isn't counted, that's counted as excess to begin with. Is there even, what is the outage quantity to report in the first place? I think that's sort of another question asked there. But I think that gets to be a little complicated and goes beyond, as I said before, that's really an outage reporting question, but I think we have to stick to just saying, if you report the outage, here's the substitution rules, and then the question of how to report the outage is a little bit, it's related, but it's a little bit beyond the scope for now. Then some of the other questions, Vistra was suggesting, what about outages outside operator control? We have some of those today, like pipeline curtailment. Should those also be exempt? Our answer here is that this is changing the status quo. I mean, today, yes, both planned and forced outages that are outside operator control, based on certain nature of work as defined in the BPM, those are range exempt and substitution exempt. This is a change in policy here that will still apply for forced outages outside operator control, but not for planned outside of the specific exemptions we highlighted. So that it is a change to how things are doing today, and that's an intentional change. Similarly, questions about burst substitution exemptions and QF units. So those are RAIM exempt, and RAIM exempt for planned, and so that sort of triggers the substitution exemption. RAIM exemptions will remain in place for forced outages, but again, the policy is outages not covered, under those very narrow cases of off-peak opportunity and transmission induced, those have a substitution obligation. And sort of the existing RAIM exemptions for those things are not meant to be porting over to this new policy. Again, similar PG&E question, what about unit testing? In those nature of works, again, same answer. Those exemptions remain in place for the forced outages, but the policy, again, is that we're really outside the transmission-induced and off-peak opportunity, substitution would be required. So I'll pause there. If any of the parties who had comments on that want to queue up, please go ahead. We can take questions now. And just to let you all know, that was the last of the material on POSO, and then I'll move briefly after we get through that to the transition period. Hopefully that'll just take a moment, and then we can really get into the minimum state of charge. There's a lot of material there to cover as well.
We do have a few questions in the queue. I'll go ahead and put the first caller through. Caller, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I guess I'm not 100% sure I understood the answers here. So we know that there was no de minimis exception in the earlier proposal. We had proposed that there be a de minimis exception. Are you saying that the CAISO has evaluated that suggestion and decided not to proceed with it? Or are you saying that it's not here because it wasn't in the other proposal, but we don't know yet whether the ISO is going to accept it? I wasn't sure I understood your answer.
Oh, okay. If something changes in the policy that adopts a de minimis exception, then we'll make changes here. But as of now, unless someone from the ISO side wants to tell me I'm wrong, I don't believe that's part of the policy. And if it had been sort of taken up, then the tariff draft tariff would change to reflect that. But as of now, I don't know that has been taken up.
Okay. Well, when do I mean the board meeting is in 2 days. Okay. When are we supposed to know, or how can we find out if the ISO has accepted this proposal or not?
Susan, this is Lauren Carr from Policy.
Hi.
Yeah, we are going to the board in 2 days, and we aren't planning to add any additional exemptions than what's already been communicated in the final proposal.
Okay, and are you going to, because it was not mentioned at all in the stakeholder comments in the memo, so I'm wondering, are you going to address it ever and tell us why you don't think that's a good idea? Or when would we find, or where would we find that information?
So, Susan, this is John Gooden. Are you asking if we would have a de minimis, and why wouldn't we do that?
Okay, if you read the comments, what the comments say, and they use the, okay, and I'm assuming you read them, or if you didn't, I'm happy to summarize. I know you had a lot of comments, so.
Susan, we've had a lot of comments, and on a de minimis, we haven't considered that, nor would I think we would, because, again, there's ideas that there's going to be a lot of smaller resources joining the fleet over time, and so any kind of de minimis criteria, that's probably not a prudent thing to do, is to start excluding resources, and I don't even understand why that would be necessary. Again, I can understand little DR resources that are very small, but again, everybody has a responsibility to substitute, and everything adds up in aggregate to something substantial.
Well, it's in the unobstructed deviation penalty language that's already been adopted, and the reason for doing it is, practically speaking, if you've got to go out and find 3 megawatts of substitute capacity, the administrative burden of that is for a very small outage is very great, relatively speaking. And it's very practical to go and find. I'm sorry, I didn't.
Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's a very burdensome thing for a small resource or for a very small outage to go out and find 3 megawatts of already substitute capacity, and when the CAISO doesn't even have a bulletin board, much less any real tools to find, a capacity market to identify this. So that was basically it was just based on practicality of the proposal.
And I would argue the same for large megawatt quantities. As things tighten, it could get very difficult as well, Susan, maybe even more difficult than trying to replace 3 megawatts versus, 100, 200, 300 megawatts. That could be very difficult as things tighten up. So I'm not sure I really buy that argument that it's so difficult to get 3 megawatts, for example.
Okay. Well, what about the question about clarifying how much what the exact magnitude is of the substitute capacity is? Is that?
Again, I don't think we know exactly that. This is a policy that's prudent, and over time, as more of these smaller resources join that become an aggregate significant and have a significant impact on the grid, that's really what we're concerned about. What we're concerned about in this initiative is future-proofing the RA program. It's not looking backwards, it's looking forward.
No, I understand. My question had to do, the second question, I apologize if I didn't separate it from the first question, but the second question had to do with the variable resources and clarifying the amount of how to calculate their substitution, how to determine how much they have to get. It's not clear. We couldn't find it in the tariff or the BPMs, and it was in a business requirements specification, I think, was the only place we found it. And even that, and that says what it says, but it's not really a tariff or a BPM. So that's why we'd ask for clarification here for that.
Yeah, maybe Abdul has that.
I mean, again, it's March. You want this to be implemented by June. I think you need to clarify how much capacity people have to find.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. Abdul, do you recall on a variable renewable resource? Or David?
Well, I can tell you what it says in the business requirements specification, and that's what was in our comment.
Sorry, what's the question about the variable resources?
Well, the question was, and in the exact example in your business requirement specifications has a 150 megawatt resource that takes part of the capacity out. So let's say I think it was something like 70 they take out, and they're being counted for, say, 50, and I might not have the right numbers right here, but let's say they're being counted for 50 megawatts of RA for that month, and they take out 70 megawatts of capacity, so they still have 80 megawatts left, and their RA NTC for that month is 50 megawatts, and that would be okay, so that it's basically as long as you leave enough in, it's not a proportional amount or anything like that. That's the example that is in your business requirement specification. The clarification we proposed here didn't get into obviously that level of detail, but it did go to that point to try and clarify what the obligation would be, because it is not calculated anywhere else in an official document besides that BRS, as far as we could tell.
Yeah, that's because it is a BRS level detail. And yeah, in your example, I think NQC would not be relevant in this case. It's really PMAX, RA, and outage D rate. And because in your example, the D rate is after the D rate, after the outage D rate, the remaining available megawatt is equal to or more than the shown RA amount for that month.
Yes. Yeah.
You will not have any substitution obligation.
Right.
Because you can meet the RA obligation.
Yeah, no, I think we agree with that, but it just doesn't say that anywhere that you would normally expect to see it. And so that's why that was the nature of the suggestion here with respect to that topic.
Okay, maybe David, I think maybe we could put that detail in the BPM. Maybe we can look into that.
Okay, if you could take a look at what we suggested here, which was the general concept, and then obviously the specifics would go into the BPM. I don't think we have any problem with that. So if you could just...
Yeah, I think we can
that's the only point they're
accommodate
making.
that, Susan.
Okay.
Yeah, we can accommodate that. We'll look into that. So yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks.
All right, we still have one question in the queue. Would you like me to go ahead and put them through?
Yes, please do.
All right. Caller, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra again. Can you hear me? Just confirming.
Yep.
Okay, great. So I wanted to bring up something and put it on the table, see if you kind of what Kaisa's thinking is about this. But rather than going straight into kind of asking my questions about planned outage to force, because I am acknowledging, David, I heard you say that considering exclusions for this kind of what I'm going to call gray area planned outage for right now or non-maintenance planned outages, technically, I've heard you that they wouldn't be considered as exceptions to this requirement to provide substitution capacity. And just one other note I'd make is that some of the examples that I gave, just so make sure we're all on the same page, even if they're for planned outages, like a plant trouble or ambient due to fuel insufficiency, even under today's rules do require substitution. So they would be still subject to rain even for those. So my questions are not just as are not coming from a like, can you include an exception to this policy so that it can be permitted and to occur and not have it subjected to rain. I am trying to play in the universe of the policy document that had been put forward. What I'm trying to identify and is that in my opinion, there is an existing confusion that the tariff introduces because of the use of maintenance outages versus kind of the planned outage versus forced outage framework in implementation that we have. I mean, in practice, if I can just say this very like layman terms, but like in practice, we have planned and forced, and it's a function of time. Did you get your outage in before or after T-8? And that's in the BPMs and that's in operations. But in the tariff, we have maintenance outages, not planned outages. So the concept in the tariff, even today, really doesn't contemplate these out-of-your-control outages that you know prior to T-8. And so, like, that's what I'm trying to shine the light on. And if we can make that clearer and kind of help to tighten this up in this process, I think there's added value in many ways if that's something that we can try and address and clarify, and just also highlight, okay, for these outages that you may know of further in advance but that you truly can't control, it's not a maintenance outage, but how are we going to talk about it? Are we even going to call it out in the tariff? It probably makes sense to have some detail on that and clarifying. So if you can't find substitution, but you have to go on outage, but that is at a minimum going to be resubmitted as a forced outage, and back on the forced outage substitution, you should be able, if you can then find substitution at a later date, that would be the most prudent thing, right, to provide that substitution to support the system as best as you can. But that's the lens and the horizon I'm looking at this from.
Right, understood. I mean, I think that is the more global changes to the outage reporting that we're talking about for phase 2. Like you're saying, today's terminology is maintenance outage or forced outage, and then I think you're pointing out, well, some things that are, quote, maintenance outage under existing tariff, it's not really an apt description of what's happening. And, you know, yes, you're right, that's a fair point, but that's sort of how the terms are today, and that's what, you know, what's being taken up in phase 2. So I think, you know, on that point, you know, we define the terms, you know, they're defined a certain way, and yes, some things that count as maintenance outages under the tariff today aren't really maintenance in the way that we think about it, but that's just sort of the way it goes in terms of the existing, you know, approach, which is based on a, you know, it's maintenance or force depending on the time frame. So, yeah, I mean, that's sort of the best I think I can say on that for now.
Yeah, and I totally understand. I am being like deeply aware of the policy history of how it evolved. I need even those papers as well. Like, it just wasn't constant. I totally get it, right? And if that's a part of what this long-term solution is, which I didn't quite capture, that's great. That's great news.
Just to let you know what it is, we're going to align the, you know, the RC has the outages about, you know, they have their own sort of terminology, and what we'd be planning to do is align the tariff terminology with the existing RC terminology. That's the concept of what we're looking at. Yeah,
no, and that's really helpful. I at this point, what I'm trying to navigate, so then that's great. I'll put that long-term thing in the parking lot for right now. What I'm trying to navigate is even between, let's say, June 1st and then, what about, I mean, what's the guidance for annual use limit reach? Just as an example, let's say a use limit resource reaches their annual limit. They submit these outages, you take them in the planned horizon, right? So they're technically under these new rules that we're looking at. And is that the clarity, right? They have to substitute it, or it's going to get canceled. I mean, can't cancel that one, right? I mean, that's what I'm just asking if the guys can think through some of this stuff, because I am nervous that some of the outages that are in play that fall under this, like, truly can't be canceled. But I agree with you, you should have an alternative compliance mechanism of RAIN effect to them. So, I mean, under this policy.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, those, I think, will wind up being reported as forced to be one. I think that's, and I think if that's really what's going on with them, then it'll be appropriate. If it's, for example, if the gas pipeline is out of service for, ahead of time that the pipeline is going to be out of service and there's nothing the generator can do about it, they can, put in for substitution as planned time frame. If they don't have the substitution, it'll be denied. And then if, they have one connection to a pipeline, that pipeline is not there, then I think that would be a okay use of a forced outage, and that would probably apply if, you're talking about an annual use limit reached or, I don't know, things of that nature.
I appreciate you talking through this with me live with everyone, and I hope this is helpful for the broader group too. That is very helpful. I think the reason I keep asking questions about it is because of the whole BPM change management process, where there's now, and I know it's not in effect currently, the language that was put forward where it said you can't submit, if a planned outage is canceled, you cannot resubmit except for certain conditions, but it was fairly ambiguous, a forced outage, and that risk is something that is still on my mind. And if there's anything you could do in this language to just clarify what you just said, if there are certain outages that are denied because you don't provide substitution, but they have to be taken, that it would be appropriate for that forced outage to be resubmitted as a forced outage, that would go a long way towards alleviating some of my concerns just about the risk involved.
Okay, fair enough. So I think we only have until 3 o'clock. I do want to, apologize. I think I need to sort of cut off the comments here because the minimum state of charge is a very important topic as well. Let me just briefly talk about the transition period language, and unfortunately, I don't think we can linger on that too long. There were questions about, this Appendix J, what all that was getting at. Let me just explain what the thought process there was, and hopefully that sort of addresses all of the questions. Okay, so the new substitution rules, essentially they are going to be in effect starting for the July RA month, and that's really what's happening. So, but because of the, I'm sorry, we have until 4, not till 3. Well, I'll still keep saying what I'm saying. We'll see if there's questions. Okay, so, but on the transition period, like I said, the planned outage substitution really is going to start taking effect for the July RA month. We're going to have a June 1 effective date for these tariff changes, because of the sort of latency of you have the RA showings and then it's in advance and so on. So the effective date of the rules will be June 1. However, the new planned outage substitution rules will start applying for the July RA month. But what that means is we will start enforcing them in June. It's just they're being enforced for outages that will occur in the July RA month. So for outages that are going to happen in June, those stay under the existing rules. And that is what the Appendix J is there for. The Appendix J is to cut and paste the status quo in Section 9, Section 40, the rules that cover things today, cut and paste that language into Appendix J to say, for outages that happen in June, the old rules apply, the old rules being what was cut and pasted into Appendix J. And then the new rules will apply, as I said, for RA outages that happen in the July RA month and beyond. So hopefully that clears up some of the confusion there. And then one other thing I'll point, when you actually look at what we put in Appendix J, there's two parts. There's Part 1 and Part 2. Part 1 is stuff that's there now that covers acquired resources. That's sort of a carryover from some exemptions starting with the SCP, which is the precursor to RAIM. You know, that's to cover a sort of an exemption if you had in a specific contracting scenario that applied from when SCP was initiated, and then so it's been carried over into the RAIM world. And so that's what we call Part 1 of Appendix J, and then what's being labeled as Part 2 is all of those existing rules on substitution in both Section 9 and Section 40. That is what is in Part 2 of Appendix J. So hopefully that helps sort of explain to folks what was going on there, because I think there was some confusion about that. And then to be clear, starting from where in the draft document you see Appendix J Part 2, from there entirely to the end of the document, that all of that is what's meant to be Part 2 of Appendix J, all of it. And basically that should be all of the sections today that touch on substitution processes. Okay? So I guess I won't recapitulate the specific written questions we got, since they were all sort of kind of around those general topics, but we'll open it up now if there's any remaining questions on sort of what that transition period was meant to be getting at.
As a reminder, to enter the question queue, please press #2 on your telephone keypad.
All right, we do have a question in the queue. Caller, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, David. This is Mike Whitney from NCTA. Thanks for having this discussion today and enlightening us with regards to, outages outside of a generator's control being assessed a substitution obligation, and, there could be some flexibility there that perhaps, they would be scheduled as forced. And in practice, the ISO typically submits like transmission-induced generator outages. So it'd kind of be up to the ISO to make sure that they submit those kind of outages in the forced time frame. Do you think that that's something that the ISO can implement in their procedures to ensure that generators aren't dinged for something that's outside of their control just because PG&E submitted transmission outage, 12 days in advance instead of 7 days in advance?
Oh, well, I guess first I'll say, so the transmission induced is one of the that is one of the exceptions for the obligation to provide substitution for all outages in the planned time frame.
Oh, okay, I misunderstood. Okay, so if a generator gets noticed that the pipeline will be curtailed, then it's up to the generator just to make sure that they submit it in the forced time frame to avoid any kind of, plan to force kind of confusion or anything like that.
So you said pipeline. So did you mean to be distinct? We have the transmission induced, and the pipeline is a separate category.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm just, there's that. Okay. There's ambient not due to temp, and then there's unit testing, and there's all kinds of stuff that has exemptions. So I'm not kind of clear of what's losing their planned exemption versus forced and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Right. So for any of those things that are being reported and enforced, then they would still have the RAIN exemptions that they have today.
Okay, but thanks for clarifying that transmission-induced generator outage maintains its planned outage substitution exemption. Appreciate it. Have a good day.
Alrighty. It appears we have no further questions in the queue at this time.
Okay, we do have two more in the chat. David, do you want me to read those out?
Yeah, please do that.
Okay. Are planned outage nature of work exemptions going away? That's the first one.
Yes. I mean, outside of the two defined exemptions we have for transmission-induced and off-peak opportunity, yes.
Okay. And then typically resources need to schedule contractors to perform work. As an example, a unit test at full load would be submitted as a planned outage. Would that outage require substitution?
Yeah. Yes. Simple.
Thank you. Those are the only two.
Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
Actually, one more just came in.
Okay.
Why have the transition for this policy instead of requesting a second effective date for the tariff sections at July 1st?
I think the question was about why don't we just have a July 1st implementation date? Was that basically the question?
Yes.
Right. Well, the reason why is because if you have a July 1 effective date of the tariff language, then how do we require substitution for outages in July that have already been approved? I mean, we want, as I said, there's, it's to capture that there's that sort of time gap between when you approve, consider the outages and when they actually happen. And so, that's not unusual that we have that sort of cutover process in this area and in RA, and there's other areas as well where you have processes that happen in advance. So you have the tariff language that goes into effect basically in advance of the time period covered by the process. For example, CRRs, is another area where you have monthly and annual processes the same way you have for RA, and so you have tariff language that goes into effect in advance of the CRR process. That, the CRRs and the time frame you need to be targeting with new rules, for example. So this kind of sort of cutover is not, it's not new. It's something we've dealt with before. I mean, did that with CPM as well, for example. That's why today we have section 43A is the CPM section instead of 43, because rather than putting it in appendix for the cutover 6 or 7 years ago, we just kept section 43 for the old process. We had section 43A for the new, and so this sort of issue is something we deal with, in other contexts than we're dealing with here. And so we need to have the effective date in advance of the RA months that we want it to apply to.
Thanks, David. And Kathleen, if you have any follow-up questions, you can enter the verbal queue as well. Okay, that's all for the chat. Do we have any questions on the phone?
We have no hands raised in the queue at this time.
Okay.
All right. So then, before going to the minimum state of charge, then there were sort of some questions on, I guess what I call the conforming changes. So we have existing, language about RAIN and POSO that's, proposed to be deleted. And then there was just sort of some questions there and sort of more general conforming changes. So first question from SCE, they're asking with the deletion of section 40.9.3.6.1 and with the mandatory substitution approach, question is, will outages still be populated in Syrah if they require substitution, or how will Syrah change? So, I mean, this is really more of an implementation thing, but what I'm told is that the substitution screen in Syrah is going to remain unchanged, and so you'll be able to provide substitution using the same interface, same approach today, and substitution will be visible after the validation has started. Another question from SCE, question about the BPM for reliability requirements. Section 9.2 and 9.3 deal with planned outage substitution and forced outage substitution respectively. Question is, how is that going to change, if at all? So as we've said a bunch of times already, the forced outage materials are really not going to change from this initiative. So section 9.3 of the reliability requirements BPM, that probably shouldn't be changing at all. Section 9.2 covering substitution for maintenance outages, that will be changed, that will have sort of conforming changes to reflect the new policy. So I'll just cover some of these other things and then we'll pause for questions. PG&E asked the question, sort of, why aren't there any edits to section 40.9.3.4D? Sort of building off some things we were talking about already. That is the section today that has some of the RAIN exemptions for certain outage types. That's where the tariff section is. It talks about, you know, outages outside control of the generator. So really, there's no edits there because, you know, RAIN is basically now inapplicable to planned outages, and that section 40.9.3.4D talking about RAIN exemptions. So, you know, really the impact of this policy is that outside of that very narrow exception I talked about way at the beginning, RAIN is no longer applicable to planned outages. It's, you substitute or you don't take the outage, period. So RAIN exemptions, you know, really on their face are no longer applicable to maintenance outages. And so, you know, the BPM will be updated to reflect that, but there's really no edits to section 40.9.3.4D that I thought were needed, because it's just by virtue of the other changes, RAIN as a thing just doesn't apply to planned outages anymore. And then so I think there's one more sort of on this general topic. San Diego was noting that some of the material in section 40.9.3.6.1 today does not apply the substitution obligation to flexible RA capacity. And so that's, you know, if there's a megawatt of RA that's purely flex, they're saying that today wouldn't be covered by the planned outage substitution processes. And then I guess the question is, what are you meaning to happen going forward? And so I think that's a fair point. I think the way we drafted the tariff as of now doesn't cover that. And so, you know, I think we'll have to probably just add that as another exemption in section 9.3.1.3.3, you know, recognizing we just spent a lot of time talking about how we can't add in any more exceptions than what's in the policy. However, here, you know, this is just sort of a way to accommodate the fact that the policy was not to change flex substitution rules. We did not envision any changes to that, and so I think the most direct way of making sure there are no changes is to just write it up as an exception. But, you know, that's sort of writing around the fact that rather than maintaining section 40.9.3.6.1 for the purpose, I'm sorry, you hear me, my phone cut off, purely for the purpose of capturing this flex only issue, we'd probably cleaner and easier just to add it as another exemption in section 9.3.1.3.3. That, you know, I'll pause again on sort of those questions about the conforming changes that I'm calling them. And if there are any questions, please dial in. We can take them now.
All right, we do have a couple. I'll put the first caller through now. Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Mike Perry from PG&E again. are you saying that for the hydro outage section, where I think it was part of the whole exceedance methodology and the way hydro resources are RAIN exempt, if you put in a planned outage card to indicate lack of water, that you would need to provide substitution?
Well, I think, let me see, I think that would be covered by some of what I was talking with Kathleen from Vistra a few minutes ago. I think, right, there are some, outages that they're not up. There's no question it's going to happen, and if you report it in the planned time frame, that it would require substitution under these new rules. But if we deny it, it has to happen no matter what anyway. And I think if, for example, hydro, if there's literally no water, then that's going to have to show up as a forced outage, presumably.
But so I think the whole point was to avoid the RAIN charges for having variability, because it's not, hydro resources aren't called out as variable. But then it would be, if it's forced, but let me say, you're right, but then it would keep the RAIN exemption. So it would be, we're not changing the RAIN exemption once it gets reported as forced. But then you would still see RAIN charges, right? And that's what I thought the whole point of the bigger effort around that was to avoid RAIN charges for hydro resources that can control whether or not. Right, no, in that scenario for the hydro, I think it would still be exempted from RAIN. Okay, I heard you earlier, so like a half an hour ago, say if you put in a planned outage and you don't, so for the hydro, say you put in a planned outage and you don't provide the substitution, and it has to happen, you'll just see RAIN charges. Oh, well, no, you'll see the RAIN charges unless there's a tariff-defined RAIN exemption for that outage for some reason. And we're not changing the existing tariff language that says the hydro who has their QC set by, an exceedance methodology or RAIN exempt. So that's not, we're not changing that. Okay, sorry, I got confused. I thought that was. Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah. Thanks for the clarification. A lot going on here, but yes, that's right. You'd be covered there. Okay, are there any other questions?
Yes, we have two more callers in the queue. Would you like me to move on to the next?
Please, yeah.
Caller, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, David. This is Weizhou from NSC. Just a quick process question. Did you mention when the BPM changes will be published, or when do you start that process? Sorry if I missed that.
You did not miss that. Luckily for me, that is not my department, so I'll have to phone a friend here. I mean, I would presume that we just really need to sort of get over the hump of getting the filing submitted, and that I think I'm sure we're sort of have in mind what the BPM changes are, and I would assume that those will get put out shortly. I don't know the exact time frame, but that typically has approximately a 2-month sort of time frame, and we're filing basically 2 months ahead of our planned, effective date of tariff filing. So it should be happening quickly. I don't know exactly when, but it should be happening soon.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you very much.
All right, moving on to our next caller. Caller, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, David. This is Rayanne Quadro from Gridwell Consulting. I don't want to prolong the conversation any longer than necessary. I just wanted to encourage the CAISO to develop more detailed outage terminology quickly for these outages that are forced outages by reason of no substitution. In the event that we had firm load drop in future, peak months, we're going to want to look back and understand who showed up and who didn't, and I think being able to distinguish load drop or outages that are forced outages versus outages that are forced outages because of the lack of substitution will be an important part of that conversation, and we'll want to have that data in retrospect.
Yeah, okay. Fair point. Do we have, I guess we can move on to the next caller. I think, yeah, I mean, we do want to try to have clean data set for whatever, analyses may be needed in the future.
Just to confirm, would we like to move on to the next caller?
Yeah. Yes, please do.
Okay. You are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Pete Torres, SCE. So, a lot of discussion regarding planned outage exemptions. So the current list of planned outage exemptions or natures of work that are exempt parallel the forced outage exemptions. So, would CAISO consider maintaining those for the planned outages?
No, I mean, I think what we put in the tariff is the extent of the, exceptions we were planning to carry over from today, which is the off-peak opportunity and the transmission-induced. But yeah, no, we were not looking to maintain the parallel treatment between the planned and forced, for the requirement to have a substitution, and that's really is part of the policy is that we're trying to, limit it as much as possible. And TIGO and off-peak opportunity were really the only ones we were considering maintaining.
Understand. Yeah. So my concern was in the past there was quite a negative light on, identical outages that were requested in the planned time frame that were denied and then resubmitted as a forced. And now it almost seems as though we're being encouraged to do that.
Well, yeah, I understand the point. I guess I'd say we're not encouraging it. What we're saying is that, again, the key question is at the time it's being resubmitted as forced, is it truly forced? And, that's sort of the principle that guides us. And so, it may be that there are more cases now where someone submits something as forced that was earlier or that was known to be necessary in the planned time frame, and there'll be just more instances where that happens, and they'll need to be ready to explain here's why that happened. And like we were talking about before, hydro, for example. Well, that dam, that reservoir had no more water, and it was August, and it ran out, and there's literally no water. It had to be forced. There may be an increase in cases where that happens, and that's, I think, just going to be a consequence of this policy, and that's just sort of something we're acknowledging, but it's, that's how it's going. Yeah, and we don't mean to be encouraging it. We're just saying that I think it might be more likely to occur now. That's probably the best I can say it.
Okay. The next question. Earlier I asked about unit testing. So typically contractors or resources need to schedule contractors in at least a few weeks out, maybe a month out, to perform unit testing for emissions purposes or whatever their needs are. So currently planned outages for unit testing nature of work are exempt. Moving forward, they will not be exempt, but it almost seems like a double jeopardy type penalty. I'm requesting a planned outage. You're getting the full load capacity, but then on top of it, I still have to substitute additional capacity for that what we're testing for. Doesn't seem reasonable to me.
Right. I see. Well, I guess we'll have to, that's another thing we'll have to think about. I mean, we had not we've not scoped in the exemptions for unit testing. That's probably the best I can tell you right now. Right. Again, your point being that when you conduct the testing, the energy is still coming to the ISO, and so therefore what to substitute means you're basically providing the same thing twice. Is that kind of what point you're making?
Yes.
Yeah, I guess you have to talk about, but I think, when you're testing, I guess you're not, perhaps one answer here would be that, when you're doing the testing, you're not sort of subject to the full range of the dispatch and so on that you would be if you just had that unit show up in the market on a normal day. I think that might be one rationale for still distinguishing it. And for now, it's probably the best answer I have.
Okay. I was going to say, typically for these unit testing outages, they are self-scheduled in day-ahead market so that the market model can pick them up.
Okay. Right. Well,
are these? Sorry, this is Abdul. I have a question. Those unit testing outages. I was going to say those unit testing outages. So you don't have a D rate on them, right? I mean, the unit is fully available, and it's just being dispatched at different levels, right?
Yep. So from a reliability perspective, right, we're scheduling a unit test. So CAISO real-time desk at any time can end the test and, take the unit wherever they need the unit to be.
Right. Okay. So
if there was a reliability issue.
If there's no D rate on the outage on the units because of the outage, then there's nothing to substitute. You're not derating the unit. You're fully available. There's really no substitution on the units, and so it's not. I guess it's not. It won't get a planned outage substitution in the first place.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I think that helps. Yeah, if in that scenario, like Abdul said, if there's no D rate, then there's nothing to substitute for. So that makes sense to me.
Are there any other questions?
At this time, we have no further questions in the queue.
Okay, well, so that gets us through, I think, all the material on the planned outage substitution changes. So, there were 3 other topics, 2 sort of smaller ones, then the big one of the minimum state of charge. Real briefly, one of the other topics was this new clarification, or really it is a clarification, saying that a new outage request is required when an existing outage is extended. There was one, let's just scroll to that real quick. I think it was 9.3.3. Give Isabel a moment here. Yeah, there it is. So if you just keep scrolling out a little bit more, I think item 6 in that list, which is, there we go. So yeah, it's this sort of language saying you must use OMS, and there's a list of sort of 5 things today, and the tariff talks about using OMS. We're adding a 6th in that list of bullets. Hopefully this is pretty straightforward for everyone that you need to put in a new outage card to cover the extended part of the outage. PG&E had a question. Really, I think they're highlighting their concern that this would put operational burden on scheduling coordinators and on the ISO's operators. I think the first answer there is, this is a clear policy issue that we determined we want to make this change, and then the tariff reflects it. So, I think here this is just the tariff reflecting the new policy. In terms of the questions about is this a good policy or not, I mean, I think really the point here was actually going to one of the comments, I think, from Rayanne a moment ago. This is part of our concern about having a cleaner data set, really, is to, have things that show up in this way, have it accurately reflected as a forced outage. In the case where you extend it last minute, that should be counted in our records as a forced outage. For example, you have a, 2-month planned maintenance cycle that showed up in the, planned time frame, all the substitution was provided, whatever, but then, 2 days before it's supposed to end, you extend it out for 2 more weeks. That 2-week extension, I think, should be counted as a forced outage, and that's the point here is we to help our records be clear. And if you do that 2-week extension in advance, while you're still in the planned outage time frame, it'll still be a planned outage, but it'll show up as a separate outage event. And I think that's just that's what we're getting at. It helps provide greater sort of clarity in the data, and we also want to have an incentive there, a little bit of a gentle stiff to get the outage done on the schedule that it was initially proposed as. And if not, okay, but really we want to submit it as a new outage ticket to be considered on its own. So yeah, that's probably the best response I can have to PG&E now. First of all, there are good policy reasons we think for this change, and the draft tariff here reflects that policy. I have somewhat of a similar answer. PG&E also had a comment, and I'll pause for questions here in a moment, on the local study criteria topic and the related CPM changes. Again, PG&E was raising some concerns about the policy approach, and that there's, they think they have some suggestions on other methodological approaches in terms of sort of getting at the hours of need and so on. Really, I think the tariff is sort of identifying a new criteria to consider in the process. I think some of the details can be covered in the actual study process, but I think high level, again, I think draft tariff reflects the policy decision. So on those topics, we'll pause there for a moment and see if PG&E or any others have any comments. And please, if we have anyone queued up, please go ahead and take those calls.
We do have one in the queue. Caller, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Just a really quick clarification on the extension of the outages and having to submit a new outage card. Depending on the timing of when that new outage card is submitted, is it and also the substitute capacity is provided for the extension, is it possible that the resource will have to provide substitute capacity but still have it count as a forced outage?
Well, if they request the extension in the planned time frame, then they'd have the automatic substitution obligation, under
right.
What you're talking about. If they request the extension in the forced time frame, then it would fall under the existing rules about forced outages.
Okay, so even though they're providing substitute capacity, they would still have a forced outage. That seems a little, I don't want to say unfair, but it seems a little illogical. If they don't provide substitute capacity, and they submit it as a forced outage, or it's counted as a forced outage, then fine. Why would they go bother getting substitute capacity if they're going to be counted as a forced outage anyway?
Well, again, the idea is, first of all, we want to have, I guess there's a couple things going on. So in this case we're talking about, we want to encourage early reporting. That's something we've talked about.
Yeah, I understand that.
Right. So the question is, if you know it needs to be extended, we want to know that early. And if you don't tell us until 5 days in advance, then it's a forced outage, regardless of whether you take the RAIM or provide the substitution.
Right.
And so that's it's a forced outage regardless, and then it's just a question of the consequences of the forced outage, whether it's RAIM or you provide the substitution. And I'd say going forward in the if we adopted the UCAP, which is the major element of the phase 2, in that case, then it would just be the forced outage. It would have the UCAP, potentially the UCAP hit, but that's sort of in the.
Yeah, but if you're going to take the UCAP hit anyway, why bother to get forced, substitute? It just seems a little illogical to do that, to substitute capacity and still count them against them, Well,
there's other changes in the UCAP proposal about substitution as well. So, kind of a different approach. So I didn't want to sort of make things too confusing. But under the rules that will exist for the near term, yeah, it'll be a forced outage. But that doesn't automatically mean you're going to get rain. And if you provide substitution, then there's no real, for the moment, further consequence of having it be called a forced outage.
Okay, so if they provide the substitute capacity, then they wouldn't have rain count against them at least.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
yeah,
all right.
If you have the substitute provided, then there's no rain. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's what I was trying to figure out. So, okay, all right, thanks for that clarification.
Okay, well, there you go.
Any other questions?
Do we have any further questions in the queue?
We do have a question that came into the into the queue. I'll go ahead and put them through now. Caller, you're now unmuted. Please go ahead.
This is Michael Volpe from PG&E. I just want to clarify, to kind of related to Susan's point, is when would the extension portion switch from being a planned to a forced? Is that T-8?
Right.
Okay, so a planned outage that had to have an extension at T-9 would put in an additional planned outage card, or would be able to extend its original?
No, it will be a new outage card. Like, yeah, if you want to request the extension at T-9, and you put in the outage card, then it would be considered a planned outage.
But if it's already a planned outage, I mean, wouldn't it make sense just to allow the existing planned outage to be extended?
Well, like we said, we want it to come in as its own outage card. If we approved the initial outage, and that was the initial one, and if you're extending it, that's for the different reasons I explained already, the policy is to have that be a totally new outage card.
Well, I thought the intent was for forced outages, the extension portion would be
for any
forced, but
no. It's for any extension beyond what was initially approved to start. That should be its own new outage card, and then whether it's forced or planned, depends on the existing rules. When did you submit that new card, which is extending, effectively what's extending the existing outage, but we're saying that should come in as its own separate outage card.
Okay, so under that construct, then at T-9, the new planned outage for the extension portion would have to show substitution for the length of the extension, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thanks for clarifying.
Any other questions?
No further questions in the queue at this time.
Okay.
All right, so I think with that, we kind of have wrapped up the first couple topics, and then we can move on to some state of charge material. So we can, go down to section 40.5. I'll give you a moment to just navigate down to that. Okay, great. We're there. So here was something, we had some, incremental changes between what we posted before and what we have now. So let me just sort of talk about what those are, and then we'll get into some of the stakeholder comments, because hopefully maybe some of these changes address them, and if not, we'll talk about them. So again, for the first sort of phrase of that first sentence, for the first 2 years following the effective date of this section 40.5, that is there to capture the idea that, as we said, we have a 2-year sunset date on the minimum state of charge tool. There's another stakeholder process that I believe has already started, or if it hasn't, it'll be shortly starting on some more global review of storage, how it's compensated, etc. That's why this is given a 2-year sunset. But anyway, so that's the prefatory comment. Then during that time period, the ISO enforces the minimum state of charge tool in the real-time market on any non-generator resources that is selected primary fuel type and master file of limited energy storage resource and is an RA resource on that day when the MSOC is enforced. This is one clarification. We added that bit about selecting primary fuel type and limited energy storage resource. That was meant to really more clearly capture sort of the universe of resources that we meant to be subject to the minimum state of charge. So some people were asking, hey, you know, you didn't carve out hybrids, you didn't, you know, what about, I don't know, pump hydro or something. So we think this is a clarification that gets us there to make clear, you know, by the terms here, you know, for example, a hybrid, VER, and storage wouldn't be covered under this. So that's who the tool will apply to, and then the next sort of sentence describing what the tool does, it limits real-time market awards to any of the covered resources. Again, a covered resource is what I just talked about. In the market intervals preceding a trading hour that is covered by the minimum state of charge as defined in 40.5.2. So 40.5.2 gets at what days and what hours will have the tool applied. But per 40.5.2, if it's an hour covered, that's the hour whose day-ahead discharge award will be sort of protected through the tool. So what we do is then, let's just scroll up a little bit. Sorry, I wasn't ready to go down to 40.5.2. Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit too much, I suppose. Anyway, so getting back here in 40.5.1, idea is the tool limits your real-time awards, any of those target hours, such that based on your operating parameters, you'll have sufficient charge to meet the discharge awards from those targeted hours. So I can't remember who made this comment, they were asking, well, isn't this tool really applying for the hours before that target hour? So it's applying then to make sure the storage resource is then charged to meet the discharge schedule in that target hour. Yes, I mean, that is what we're getting at here. So it's the tool limits real-time market awards to any covered resource in the market intervals preceding the trading hour that we're trying to protect. So that was a clarification we added. And then the last sentence there, hopefully it addresses the concern, and you know, if others will speak up if that's problematic. There was this concern about, well, but be clear, the MSOC tool is really there. It's to get the storage resource teed up to meet its discharge schedule in an hour. Once you hit that hour, the tool isn't really applying anymore. And you know, added that last sentence to sort of clarify that, and hopefully that makes sense. For one, that makes sense. That the idea here is you're setting it up to hit that sort of target hour. Once we get to that hour of the day-ahead discharge schedule, the tool is off, and then things flow from there. So that is sort of the tweaks to section 40.5.1. I'll just briefly talk through the tweaks to 40.5.2 and the new 40.5.3, and then I'll get to the specific questions. Okay, so that's 40.5.1 talks about how the tool operates. 40.5.2 talks about when the tool operates. So as we said before, and what was posted in the draft we had posted, it's tied to days when there's a ruck in feasibility. So if there's, you know, in the day-ahead market, there's any hour that had a ruck in feasibility, then that sort of sets it up as a day when the minimum state of charge tool will apply. So if there's no ruck in feasibilities for a day, the tool is not going to apply, period. Okay. So then you get to a day where there's a ruck in feasibility. What hours are we concerned about? You know, what are the hours where the day-ahead discharge schedule will be protected through the tool? So that will be in the hours where that ISO projects will be the net peak load hours of that day. So we have, say, the highest ISO system load net of wind and solar output. The way we sort of had it framed up in the draft that was posted previously, it was saying we're automatically going to apply it for every hour of the day, and then operators will have the discretion to turn it off for hours they determine aren't necessary. You know, this sort of tweaks it a little bit, but it sort of isn't that different. It's just saying it will be, you know, even on a day with the rough infeasibility, it will still be off until at the time the day ahead is sort of being formulated, we project what are the hours with the highest net system load. It will be turned on for those hours, and then it's on. So as you roll into the day ahead, when you roll into the real time, the specific trading hours that the MSOC tool protects, those are set at the time the day ahead schedules are sort of finalized. So that's when the tool applies. And then moving to 40.5.3, this was a new subsection we added. You know, there were some concerns that there wasn't enough sort of description about how we're going to provide transparency about when the tool applies. That's what this section does. It says basically we're committing to at the time or approximately the time, don't want to tie your hands too much, but the idea is basically approximately 1 p.m., which is when day-ahead market results are posted now. At that point, we would also post notification. Is this a day where there was a rough infeasibility? That means the MSOC tool is potentially being enforced. And then we'll also post, here are the trading hours that we have determined are the hours that we need to protect going into the next day in the trading in the real time. These are what we project would probably be the net peak load hours. These are the hours whose day-ahead discharge schedules need to be protected through this new tool. So that is sort of the organization of 40.5, which now covers the minimum state of charge tool. So, you know, rather than going through point by point on the questions, I'll just pause there and see if any of the parties who submitted questions, if you have any further questions. I mean, hopefully I'd like to think that addressed a lot of them, but anyway, we'll just see if you have any questions that did not address, please queue up and we'll take them.
As a reminder, you can enter the question queue by pressing #2.
We do have 2 questions in the queue at this time. I'll go ahead and put the first caller through. Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from District. First, I want to say, David, thank you so much for, I know, and especially for us, we got our suggestions in late, and just the sheer amount of information you processed, you and the rest of the TISO team, to even put forward kind of these changes. I really appreciate that. So I wanted to acknowledge that, and thank you all for the time that you spent putting this forward. It's a lot to process, so we may still have some follow-up feedback, but I just wanted to right off the bat say thank you for taking the time and trying to resolve some of the questions and that we submitted through the stakeholder process. With that, can I do?
But.
Oh yeah. So there's not a but. There's not a but. There's not a but. I promise. There is a. Can we get a little nerdy with defined terms in section 40.5.1?
Oh, dispatch instructions. Yes, you had a comment about that.
Yeah, you know me. Nerd out hard on this kind of stuff. So I did just, and I fully recognize this is super nerdy, that in the defined, I think some of my comments of, I think in this language you don't have the issue of the duplicative market, but in the Appendix A, you had real-time market, real-time market, and so I flagged that and suggesting to remove the second market in that. But then also the real-time market dispatch instruction is a defined term, and I think that's the closest defined term that you're trying to capture in even this section. And so just suggesting maybe use that for consistency, simplicity.
Yeah, no, I remember there was one comment, there was one tweak I saw you made that I realized was definitely needed, and I think you should see that reflected in what's being projected right now. Yeah, the issue of the dispatch instruction, here's what I was thinking there is that the real-time market also includes FMM, and so I think this is where we get into the details of the actual operation of the tool, but I guess, not necessarily having the dispatch instructions from the FMM, but that's still part of the RTM, which is still covered. So I was, you know, I wasn't sure if dispatch instructions was necessarily correct, given that we, you know, also have to think about the FMM. I mean, I didn't have any strong feelings there, but I honestly wasn't sure if, you know, if I was spinning myself in circles on that or not.
And I appreciate you inviting me to the circle game. That's interesting. I'd have to look at it, think about it a little bit more. But yeah, thanks for thinking about it. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I saw that comment. I was sort of, anyway, yeah. Do you have other remaining questions?
Just a clarifying, so am I understanding correctly that this revised language is removing that operator judgment piece?
Well, kind of. It's yes. What we had before, which I think was really missed the mark, honestly. Yeah, the idea that they can, once you get into the operating day, you can pick hours to turn it off. I think that like I said, I think that missed the mark. It was more, it's set during the day ahead, and then the potential for operator judgment then, but then it's set at that point. And it's on or off, and it's going to stay on or off, rolling into real time.
Great, thank you. One more clarifying question on the new text is the hours of the net peak, kind of the highest. Was just curious if that had some boundaries around it. So the way it reads is kind of like the highest hours, but is that the highest 4, highest 5, highest 6? Just guiding that as something maybe worth thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, the idea was the net peak load hours, you know, I don't know that we get in our head about what that is, sort of 4 or 5 peak hours, but to be specific, like you said, is it the top 5 or top 6? I guess we hadn't really meant to define it that precisely to leave some sort of judgment in it. I guess we can think more if it would, you know, if we put a boundary on it of, you know, the top 5 hours or no, you know, to sort of limit it. It's not going to protect the schedules for more than 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours. I don't know. I think that's something we could think about. I'm not sure what the right number is there.
Great, thank you. And thank you again. I really appreciate it.
All right, great. Do we have any other callers in queue?
We have 2 more callers in the queue at this time. I'll go ahead and put them through now. First caller, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, this is Elvis Kubota at PG&E. I had a question about your phrasing was that the tool would be turned off as soon as there was enough stated charge to meet the net peak hour schedules. Was that correct? Did I understand you saying that correctly? I mean, in the sense that you would not charge further, and you would stop enforcing the constraints at the beginning of the hour that was of concern. Is that because the reason I'm bringing that up is because I'm wondering about the case where you have a partial award in the first of a series of hours, so that if you dispatch to full in the first hour, you might, because of the stated charge you're at, you might not be able to fulfill the awards in the remaining hours of the net peak. And I was just wondering about that scenario.
Yeah, so I think the way, yeah, I kind of was thinking about that in drafting it, and let's see. So it's we're limiting it to market intervals preceding any trading hour that meets requirements. So in the case where there's, you know, if we're just protecting the schedule for one net peak load hour, then it's simple. If you have multiple hours, all of those hours are going to be hours that meet the requirements, and therefore each of them is subject to the tool. So, if you have 3 net peak load hours you're concerned about, say 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, you could still be worried about protecting the 6 o'clock schedule at 4 o'clock, which is also being fixed. So I meant to draft it to cover that scenario because, 4 o'clock, even though it's its own thing that needs to be protected, you also need to be worried about the 6 o'clock hour at the time you're looking at 4 o'clock. And I think it was meant to be drafted to cover that.
Okay. I wasn't clear about the way you were describing it. I'm assuming that's the way the tariff language is. And of course, that would mean then that potentially you would not be able to dispatch up in a net peak hour that had a partial award because you were protecting the awards in the later hours?
Hey, Alva, this is Gabe Murtaugh here.
Yeah, Gabe,
I think so, but let's just say you've got a resource and you've got an award for 20 megawatts, an hour ending 17, and then 40 megawatts, an hour ending 18, and 40 megawatts, an hour ending 19. So that's a total of 100 megawatt hours. So in hour ending 16, at the end of that hour, you're going to want to position the resource so that it has 100 megawatt hours. And that's the constraint that we're going to enforce. We're going to say in our real-time market optimization that, resource ABC must have at least 100 megawatt hours of state of charge by the end of the hour, and we'll make sure that the resource gets there in hour ending 16. And then there could also be, depending on what the ramp rate is, the resource and other parameters, there might be constraints imposed on previous hours as well. Then after you get through hour ending 16, you're also going to have a constraint on hour ending 17 because you now need to protect 80 megawatt hours for the next 2 hours.
That's right.
So we'll also impose that constraint.
Yeah. So I just was clarifying that would have the effect I was saying of potentially you would not be able to dispatch up in a net peak hour. That's just the way this would be. That's one effect of this, which is probably exactly what you want. You want to just protect the actual awards as opposed to the flexibility is what you're really trying to protect with this constraint anyway.
That's right.
So, okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for the question.
All right, are we ready to move on to the next caller?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Caller, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, David. It's Ryan Quadro from Gridwell again. I just wanted to really drive home some clarity on the real-time tool. In the presentation at the last meeting, the indication was that real-time would be able to cancel or initiate. Now are you saying that they're only going to be able to cancel, not initiate it in real-time, because the day ahead will drive whether or not it's okay to initiate it in real-time?
Well, I think this has been dynamic, and so I'm not sure I'm not sure which meeting you're talking about, but I believe that whatever we have, the tariff language we're projecting now should reflect what the sort of policy that's about to be adopted is. So I'm not sure, things have been dynamic, but it should.
I'm referring to
Gabe, tell me if I'm wrong.
23rd meeting.
Yeah,
let me figure out if the policy has changed during tariff development.
Yes, it has.
No, I think
currently
let me just stop. Right. The policy has continued to evolve. We're not changing policy through tariff drafting. The policy is what it is. The tariff is just reflecting the policy. But yes, policy itself has continued to evolve. So, Gabe, I just want to make that point clear. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a good clarification, David. And the only thing I was going to add is that, yes, in light of stakeholder feedback, we are planning to only allow the operations team on the day of a potential RUC and feasibility to basically turn off the tool. We're not giving them, operations team the ability to turn on the tool in the real-time market. That's in direct response to stakeholder feedback that we got from the final proposal of resource adequacy enhancements. We will be talking about this at our Board of Governors meeting, and we also will be putting out an updated version with that language struck out of the final proposal. So do be looking for that. But I think that's a really good point to clarify. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not trying to be adversarial. I totally understand we're all just ramping up to prepare for the summer. It is more sort of a symptom of just my trying to track, these ever many complicated things. So thank you so much, and I appreciate the clarification.
At this time, there are no further questions in the queue.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for sticking with this. There's a lot of material to cover, but hopefully that at least helps, kind of orient you all to what we were thinking in terms of trying to translate the policy to tariff. I think this is going to the board, Wednesday this week, and that, or Wednesday, Thursday, whatever it is. We are, looking to get the language approved and in effect for June 1, which means the filing will be happening shortly thereafter from the board meeting, probably, very early next week. So we'll, next step, I guess, would be the board meeting and then the FERC filing. So with that, I think I don't have anything more to add. I guess I'll give one final chance if anyone is still has a question they want to queue up for. Otherwise, I think we can wrap it up.
As a reminder to enter the question queue, you can do so by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad.
At this time, I see no questions in the queue.
Okay, thanks, David. Well, if there are no further questions, I think we can conclude today's stakeholder call. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
That concludes today's conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.